Today's video is a little bit different, and that's because this is a repeat presentation of one that I gave at Transport Camp a couple of weeks ago, which is basically an unconference for people interested in transport and transport professionals. And in this, we try to answer the question, has COVID killed public transport? Bit of a spoiler alert, we don't quite end up answering this question definitively, but we do have some information that might help us get there. So before we get stuck into the presentation properly, I wanted to flag this up front. In a lot of discussions around COVID and transport, a lot of people assumed that it reduced overall travel demand. But from all the data that we've been able to collect, it didn't actually do this. It just changed it. And we'll see in a little while from some of the graphs how it changed. But I just wanted to put this up front to clarify it because I have seen it repeated in many places. I've put this slide here to refresh our memories. We obviously had a lot of impacts of the COVID pandemic, but one of the most significant that impacted transport specifically were lockdowns. There were various forms of restrictions during this time. Most relevant for transport, of course, were the travel restrictions. During this time, there were various travel restrictions, generally in terms of distance, so you weren't permitted to leave your principal place of residence past 5 kilometres or 10 kilometres or whatever the radius happened to be. And you also weren't permitted to travel or leave your place of residence without having a valid reason. And some of these impacts obviously related to public transport. So now we're going to dig a little bit into this and see what happened. To start off, I thought I would include this graph as a point of comparison. This is the annual rail patronage from the United Kingdom between 1990 and 2022. This comes from the Office of Rail and Road Statistics. As you can see, it's a pretty steady increase in patronage from 1990 till about 2019, and then it falls off a cliff in 2020-21 for obvious reasons. In 2021-22, it did have quite a significant recovery, almost, more than half of what it was in 2019-20. And I just want you to keep this in mind as we look at the statistics for Melbourne. The first graph we're going to look at for Melbourne is this public transport patronage graph that I've pulled together using statistics from previous annual reports from Department of Transport, PTV, and all the other transport entities that have existed in Melbourne since 1949. So 1949, 1950, huge numbers of passengers using all modes of public transport. We saw the boom during the Second World War, of course, when we had fuel rationing and other restrictions. And then we obviously see the steady decline until about the 1980s with the constant uptake of cars and road-based forms of transport replacing a lot of public transport trips. This was the low point really in terms of total trips. And then we start to see a slight increase from there with the investment that was done into public transport, such as the City Loop and a range of other things that were done. Then in the mid-2000s, we see the huge rise in public transport across mainly tram and train, and that continued more or less, although it flattened out a little bit in the early 2010s, before again falling off a cliff 2020 due to the pandemic, and then a slight bump up in 2022. One of the interesting things here from this graph is to compare it to the previous graph that we saw from the UK, where the recovery between 2021 and 2022 is nowhere near as significant here as it was in the UK. So this next graph kind of zooms in a little bit on that last 5-year period to give you a better look at what's going on. Again, this shows that sudden drop between 2019 and 2021. The 2019 to 2020 figure obviously does include some non-pandemic periods of time because this is done by financial year. So between July 2019 and June 2020. And obviously we started that first lockdown in March 2020. So as I mentioned before, I think it's interesting to drill down a little bit into the modes. So we're going to have a little bit of a look now at what's going on between trams, trains and buses. The thing to note about this graph is 2021 and 2022 and the proportion of trips that are being carried by bus. It's not an insignificant increase. If you look between 2020 and 2021, it's about a 7 or 8%, maybe a 7% increase in the proportion of trips. I think this can be at least partially explained by the fact that buses in Melbourne generally service areas that have a lot more service workers or essential workers that needed to travel to their workplaces even during lockdown. These suburbs generally aren't serviced by trams or trains, which is why that percentage has increased. There may be other explanations too, but I think that's a big part of it. Another way to show this data is through this line chart, and what this kind of highlights is that in 2021, we almost reached a point for the first time since that data was recorded since 1949, where buses were carrying more passengers than trams. Another key message is that there was obviously less work in the CBD. These next few charts come from an Infrastructure Victoria report, and the reference is at the bottom of the slide if you're interested in reading the whole document. So what this graph shows is a huge decline in workplace activity in the CBD. Most of the white-collar jobs in the CBD were classified as non-essential, so that's when kind of people started to work from home. So obviously having fewer people working in the CBD and working from home led to significantly more workplace activity in the suburbs. Something to note with these two graphs for Victoria specifically, the orange line in both of these graphs, is that we see an uptick in working in the suburbs and a downward trend in the working in the CBD from the previous graph towards the end of these charts, which covered July 2020. And that's because Victoria entered a lockdown, whereas most of the other jurisdictions compared in these charts did not. Unfortunately, the graphs don't go any further than that because of when the report was published, but it is interesting to see how that has kind of impacted Victoria compared to some of the other states. Something else that was interesting from this report was some analysis that was done using Vista data. Now, Vista stands for Victorian Integrated Survey of Travel Activity. It's a survey that's done every 2 years by the Department of Transport on a representative sample of trips throughout Victoria. This gives us a much better and more granular understanding of what trips are taken in the state. For example, the census only covers journeys to work and education, which are only about 25% of all trips. So this chart compares the 2020 Vista survey data, which was done during a lockdown, with the Vista 2018 data, which was done 2 years earlier under pre-COVID conditions. As they note here, there was a large increase in the number of trips taken by active transport, but public transport fell significantly across the board. The main impact though were the work-related trips, which you can see on the third row down, and that was quite a drop. One more thing from this Infrastructure Victoria report is comparing driving to public transport. Obviously during lockdowns, all modes of travel were affected. But what we have seen in Melbourne and Victoria is that driving has returned to pre-pandemic levels or has even gone higher than that, and public transport use has kind of lagged behind as we saw in those previous charts. This chart here shows the impact of that first and the start of the second lockdown on driving in Melbourne. You can see it's that orange line there on the left and the right side of the chart. So that's a quick summary of what's going on with COVID and public transport. Overall, public transport use is still down. It is coming back up, but quite slowly, and it remains to be seen how long that's going to take. We know that people will come back to public transport. We've seen that in other countries and other jurisdictions. The only question for us is when. And again, just to reiterate, travel has changed and where people are traveling has changed and when, but the overall demand has not decreased. People still need to get around. It's just that the time that they're traveling, where they're traveling, and how they're traveling are the things that have changed. That's all for today. If you enjoyed the video, please feel free to subscribe to the channel so that you can stay up to date on future content. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.